Here's a simple watercolour painting of Laycock village in Wiltshire, UK. Very, very pretty village in the UK, owned by the National Trust. I think nearly all of it by the National Trust in the UK, and there's a lovely abbey there. Very popular tourist destination, quintessential English village, used a lot for filming TV programs. But this is a view up one of the main streets here, and very nice from a watercolor painting point of view. Lots of contrast, bit of perspective with the buildings. But here I need to think about composition and what to leave in, what to leave out in the scene, which I'll decide in the thumbnail sketch. Now, if you're a Patreon member, please go to my Patreon site, patreon.com/Tim Wilmot. This is where I can share, or this is where I'm able to share my source image here and my end painting as a high-res photograph. And if you have a go, if you're a Patreon member, if you have a go, please post your entry, your effort on the community tab on Patreon. So hello, my name is Tim Wilmot, watercolor painter, tutor, creating YouTube videos here up on YouTube. Welcome to this video. So I'm going to go through a complete step-by-step demonstration of this village scene, Laycock in Wiltshire, UK. Starting off with a thumbnail sketch, go through the actual painting itself, the different stages. I'll give as much commentary along the way as well, and end up with a debrief of the scene at the end. This is my quick thumbnail sketch, just to really get in my own mind the composition and the focal point, my values, little indication of colours there as well. You can see that I've just written down some colours just to try and plan the colour composition and the values I'm going to be using. So I've put in there lighter, because I can see there's a bit of light hitting the step in front of a doorway. So I've put down there lighter, and then blue for the shadows here, cobalt green for the doorway, the sort of sage green doorways, and then over the right hand side some darker shading where we've got the gap between the houses and some parked cars on the right hand side. And then right at the end of the street we've got that attractive building with the timbers on, those old timbers on the front, which is very typical of the houses in Laycock. So there we are. I do share this, so just repeat, up on patreon.com/Tim Wilmot. If you remember, you can see all these source images. So let's get started. The paper I'm using is Saunders Waterford. This is cold press. 300 grams, 140 pounds, 15 inches by 11 inches. What's that in metric? 35-ish by, no, 37-ish by 27, something like that, centimeters. And I'm just drawing the skyline, just really looking at the shapes of the outline of the rooftops against the sky, and partly considering my thumbnail sketch as well, just to get in those geometric shapes of edges and angles, getting those right. Now placing the couple of figures, just a bit of cross-hatching indicating that the figure is coming towards us and where the face will be. And there's the second one, just slightly lower than the first figure, angling down. then an indication of where the dog's going to be. Perhaps the second figure, an outstretched arm to the dog, and then on the right third there's the brightly lit car, a few lines to edge the rooftops and some verticals. On the right hand side there's a couple of cars I'm going to have parked up, maybe facing towards the houses, just a slight inclination. The road goes up just a little bit at an angle towards the houses, so there's the back of that car, back of the nearest car, the bottom of the car, just a bit of cross hatching too, so I can just record where the shadow, the shade's going to be. Quite important to get these angles right of the gable ends of the building, and then almost a 45-degree angle of the edge of the roof, and then another 45-degree angle, 45-degree-ish angle of the street level. Bit of ivy growing over the doorway, and this semicircular step. Just finish off these figures. They're going to really melt into the shadows, so don't want to be too bothered with the bottom halves of those. At the far end of the street there's a little bit of rooftop going out and a chimney, some chimneys on the right. And then there's a shadow being cast across the joint of the two houses. Get that angle right, then there's a bit of timber work in the top part of this building. So that's just the dividing line between the two. And the edge of the shadows going across the street, which I'll sort of copy. I'll go along those lines. That's pretty much the drawing done, which I did with a 3B pencil, just to make sure the lines are fairly dark, fairly soft pencil, quite dark. And I've said this before, but I don't mind the pencil lines showing through the drawing. It's not sort of like an accomplished exhibition work. Right, so drawing done, and on to the painting. And my process is laying down this first wash, which is starting off normally with the sky, and lay it in across the middle, yellow ochre across the rooftops, across the tops of the rooftops, and quite a weak wash of yellow ochre, and then going with a more intense blue to the top. Now this is just the undercoat here, not, I'm going to be going over this again, but just painting in that the end of that house, which is quite light, so I've gone in with a bit of a blue, and then the buildings on the right hand side. Brush I'm using is a Raphael Soft Aqua brush. It's a synthetic mop brush, so being a mop brush, holds a lot of water, it's got a good edge to it, and it's an imitation squirrel, so it's actually quite soft. Go around carefully the figures, don't need to be too careful with the heads, but certainly the bodies of the figures, just to keep my options open on what colour I'm going to be doing their clothing, which I'm undecided about, but I need to keep them light compared to the background, so I've painted around those. Left hand side, this is again this is just the undercoat. I will go over that again with a darker colour. This is just to really cover up as much of the paper as needed. Now the road is cooler, so I've gone in with a little bit of blue. Let me just go through my colours on the palette. So starting from the top, neutral tint, then burnt umber, burnt sienna, yellow ochre, viridian green, cobalt green, a cerulean blue, cobalt blue, and then ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson. There's the ultramarine blue. After alizarin crimson is Windsor red, which I use the red car, and then light red, and then cadmium orange, lemon yellow, and then right down the bottom in the middle there's a lavender. Right, just continuing this wash all over the paper, around those figures, continue down into the foreground, go a little bit cooler and richer down here. And my brush strokes now are a bit more erratic compared to the sky. The sky I had to lay down as a flat wash, so I was laying in mainly horizontal brush strokes, and then in the foreground here, because I want some variation in the texture and values in that foreground, I've just gone in a sort of haphazard way, just angular brush marks. Mop up the bead if it's accumulating a little bit too much. The border's on a slight slope here, about 10 degrees or so. So it will gradually accumulate down the bottom, so I just mop that up just in case it doesn't, well, just to prevent it going back into the painting. Now the rooftops on the right hand side, I'm going to go for a soft edge between the actual top of the roof and the sky. I could go with a hard edge, I could let all this dry and then go in with a darker colour, but I've made this decision to go in with a softer edge. So I need to make sure, because everything is still quite damp, I need to make sure this paint is a good bit thicker, so less water to pigment ratio. And I'm just testing it a little bit with a brush just to see how much it travels. I don't want it to travel too much. Actually, the paper is a bit dry on the right hand side. Because I didn't pre-wet the paper, it dries quicker on the edge than in the middle, as you'd expect. And so I got that little bit of a harder edge there on the very right hand side. Just check my edge of the brush, and with a flat edge, just gently, if I do think it's going to spread a little bit too much, I'll either thicken up the mixture or stop what I'm doing, or maybe even get out the hairdryer just to speed up the drying process to stop the spread of the paint. Because with this Saunders Waterford paper, it does spread quite a bit when it's damp. Paint moves around a bit, so got to keep an eye on it if you haven't judged it right. So I'm going to get out the hairdryer now just to speed up that drying process, to both speed things along and stop any further spread of paint before I go on to the next stage. So if you want to have a go at this, my Patreon members have access to this video ad-free, and I share on Patreon, I share the source video, the source photo and the my end painting, as well as high res images for my Patreon club. So check out patreon.com/Tim Wilmot for more details. Meanwhile, I'm just making sure this is totally dry. The paper would have buckled a little bit, so I can tell when it's dry when the paper goes a bit flatter. And I'll just touch it with my fingertips just to make sure it's absolutely dry before going on to the next stage. But the next stage, I do need to get some harder edges into the painting. So that's why I need it to be absolutely dry. And that on the right hand side, that blue car and the red car, it doesn't matter that the blue and the red has just sort of seeped into the outlying area, because you will see in bright sunlight that colour permeating into objects around it, where that colour is reflected. You know, they're sort of metallic cars, bright sunlight, so it's going to that colour's going to bounce around a good bit. So the next stage is adding in darker values to give us depth and more interest in the painting. I'm using a smaller mop brush. This is a Winsor & Newton, a squirrel mop brush, size 10, I think, so it's about 10 millimeters across. I'm going quite dark with the upper story here on the left hand side, but I want to leave in some vertical strips of light just to give the impression of the upper windows. So quite dark. This will dry a bit lighter, so I might need to compensate by going in with darker pigment later on, darker values later on. And a slightly horizontal top to that roof. Bit of cerulean, bit of cobalt there. And holding the brush, now I need to be a bit more precise here with the brushwork, so I'm holding it closer to the tip of the brush. That second window. As I come down into the fronts of these houses, I'm going to pick up a bit more yellow ochre to give it that sort of authentic, almost like Cotswold stone. I'm not sure if it is actually Cotswold stone, but very similar colour to Cotswold buildings. And a little bit of blue in the mix. Continue down. If I want to brighten it up, add in a bit of cadmium orange. Vertical marks just to expose a few little lights at the end there. Could be some windows, and windows just catching a little bit of reflected light. Now, blue here, cooler for the stonework on the left hand side going towards the doorway, and some brush marks just following along the mortar lines of this wall. So just have just a few little lighter patches that might be where the brickwork is catching a bit more light. Tiny bit darker towards the bottom, then following that 45-degree angle, go around this step. Want to go quite cool there on that step. It's sort of more of a greyish blue colour to the paving stones on that, but it does catch the light. So I'll do a bit of lifting off. It does catch the light towards the front edge of that step. So the paint in my palette is quite moist now, so I can really just pick it up and place it on the paper and then just move it around, add a bit more water on the paper. I generally lay down this shadow, wherever I've got figures on top of a shadow, I'll lay down the shadow first, then drop the figures into it just so that they blend. For me, that works better doing it that way around. They blend a little bit closer together. Quick brush marks on the lower right corner just to give a bit of dry brush mark, a softer edge to that, a bit lighter as well. Shadows are a bit lighter towards the edge on the right hand side, a bit darker towards the house. Right, I've got a smaller brush, synthetic brush, just to get in some of these darker bits. To find these darker bits, I probably need to do it again a little bit more later on, but this is the first application of that. So a small synthetic brush, picking up almost pure pigment from my palette, and any dark value would do here. I'm picking up mainly neutral tint just to get in the initial definition of the top of the wall and the street level of the wall. Now, while that's slowly drying, excuse me, I'm going to paint in this end house. The top part of this house facing towards us is white, but it's in the shade. So I've gone with a mid-blue colour. And then the lower half is the continuation of this sort of sandy colour. Paint carefully around the figures, bit of negative painting around those figures. And then to the second figure, around the head, check my edge of the brush. So this brush has got quite a good edge, so it just helps me be a bit more precise, painting around the top of the figure. And then the right hand side. Across the top of the outstretched arm, and then back to the building at the end of the street. Bit of a darker colour. Be careful with my hand, don't smudge anything below the palm of my hand. And then it's a little bit darker on the left hand side. Horizontal rooftop, and on the right hand side with the tall chimney on the edge of that. Check the edge of my brush again. Chimney, little bit of a funny top to it, and down. Now going over to the right-hand buildings. There's a 2 or 3 triangular gable ends at the far end of the street, so this is the rooftop around those. Check the edge of my brush. They're just triangles, really. Just mop up a few little beads there that were accumulating at the bottom of the page. So just painting in the bottom parts of these figures. Face, arms, bit of shadow going across. That the left-hand figure is going to be in the shadow a little bit more than the right-hand figure. So a bit more part of the body exposed on the right-hand figure, then the bottom of that figure, just the shadow area is still quite damp, so it's going to give me a soft edge with that darker colour. And then the doggy, I need to bring that dog down a bit. It's a bit too high at the moment. Bottom left corner, darker colour with this small synthetic brush just to create the edge of the step, and then beyond the step we're going up the street. And the ivy across the top of the doorway there, just really a lot of brush marks just to denote that that sort of climbing ivy across the top. And this doorway here, cobalt green. There's a lot of, well, it's probably more a sort of sage green, I would have thought. The colour of a lot of the doorways there. It's a lovely colour and just right for the buildings there. But the closest I've got on my palette is this sort of cobalt green, which it's sort of in the shade, so you can't see it as a bright sage green. It's sort of that cool green colour, and just dotted around a few extra places on that left-hand side. There's a shrub in the distance that's going to create a nice bit of dark contrast against the lighter figures. So I'm just painting that in there, going up to the left-hand side of that larger figure. Need a good vertical edge on that shrub, and then it just comes down and melts into the street. Right, now defining the timber work at the end, this building at the end of the street. Just first of all, define the left and the right hand side of the roof, and then there's this little bit of a curved horizontal line, and then lower down it sort of steps up above the lower story, and some little vertical marks, dry brush marks, not too much water on the brush, very gently. So they're not too hard marks. I don't want them to be too dark and the edges to be too hard, otherwise that whole layer is going to come further forwards. Not too much water on the brush. I picked up a bit of red, bit of burnt umber, bit of neutral tint, and going into a few areas of the painting, just strengthen up the edge of that ivy, edge of the roof, and the roof on top of that first gable end, neutral tint, alizarin crimson, and this second one here. I could actually have used a bigger brush for this. I'm just using this, I'm just continuing with this brush out of convenience, really. But I always think about the size of the brush depending on the area that you're painting. And when I first started my painting, I was laying down a wash over the whole paper. Well, I used the biggest brush I had. But then as I go into smaller areas of the painting, I'm using smaller size brushes. Just create the far edge of that semicircular step, the right-hand side of the doorway, a little bit, just the initial lines. I might need to strengthen this up with some harder lines, but the mortar lines on this brick wall on the left-hand side, just a few windows, details. I can see that guy's trousers, they've dried quite a bit lighter than when I first painted them. I need to go in a bit darker on those. Next, the right-hand side, going back to my medium-sized mop brush, so I've got a good edge to this brush and creating that quite dark shadow underneath the eaves of the roofs on the right-hand side. And then I need to do that stronger shadow where the two houses join. Chimney and that one there. But when I did my drawing, it was leaning a little bit, but let's now straighten it up a bit more vertical. That's a little bit better than my initial drawing. And the end of this building where it joins the other one, vertical shadow coming down to the tops of the cars, the two parked cars there. That defines the rooftop of those cars. This middle car or van, I haven't really decided what sort of vehicle it is. doesn't really matter. It's just, you know, a lighter object there, almost on that right-hand third. So I'm painting the body of the car first, then going with darker, thicker paint for the shadow underneath the car, the shadow going across the road over to the right, and almost connecting with the parked cars. It's always good to try and connect these different shapes together so that things don't stand out too much on their own. Right, a little bit of shadow now to define the right-hand edge of the blue car around the red car. And the shadow on the red car down to the road, going a little bit darker for the shadow underneath these two cars, connects the shadow from the middle car to these two parked cars, and then just continue them up, thinking about that slight slope on that side of the road, just going tiny bit upwards. And there's the shadow on that right hand roof. Now a few windows. That could be a sign. Windows coming down from the eaves of the roof. So edges on the car, the back windscreens, lower story details on those. Far houses, a few little windows. Try to make them a bit softer as I go into the distance, not too dark, otherwise they'll have the appearance of coming a little bit too far forwards. Again, I'm just connecting here, drawing in, painting in various marks, and just really joining them together. The front grille on that car, strengthen up the shadow on the side of that face. The second figure, just make that line there a bit stronger. Burnt umber, neutral tint. Another doorway, bit bolder edge around this near doorway. Make some of those lines a little bit stronger. Think about adding a bit more of a darker object between these two figures, just to add something to the back of that street, but also a bit of extra contrast between their lighter clothing. Bit more detail at the tops of chimneys and the end of the street. Some little darks at the back there. Strengthen up that windscreen, adding a bit of dark reflections on the right hand side. I'm painting and there's a squarish sign on this building on the left, so I'll put that in there. Not actually put any wording on it, but just the actual shape of the sign. Just breaks up that left hand side and just in a way it almost balances up the composition a bit more as well, just having that that sort of squarish rectangular shape there. I picked up a brush now, another synthetic brush with a finer tip to it, a finer point to it, just so I can define some of those edges a bit more. It wasn't good enough, so I've gone to, this is a Lebanson liner brush, rigger brush, very good for doing very fine lines. I think it's about the best brush really for doing these fine lines, little hair lines, well, the thickness of a hair. Great for doing ropes or lines or fences, twigs, bushes. I think this one's actually got a small, it's called a small soft white brush, I think, but it's, to me it's like a rigger brush, synthetic brush. Quite soft. It's not good for doing, for actually putting in a lot of darker paint. It's good for doing these very fine lines. You can see there it's hardly making any impression at all because it's so soft. Right, go back to my normal synthetic brush that's got the shorter length hairs. And I think this street needs some tire marks or lines on the road just to help lead the eye in from a perspective point of view and add a bit more texture to the road as well. And this road doesn't have any, being where it is, and I think because it's used a lot for filming, there's no yellow lines there. So you can't actually see the edge of the road. You're just running from one side of the street to the other. It's just all the same, almost the same material, same surface. It's still a little bit damp, that paper on the left hand side, so as I'm going in there with my brush, it does blend quite well into the paper. Smudge with my finger, just make this line a bit more solid between the two figures. If it's a bit too dark, just with my fingertip, just gently ease it off. Create a stronger edge there with that figure up to the face. And then on the right hand side, just whatever that object is, just continue it over to the right hand side. Make this bush a bit darker with Viridian Green and neutral tint. Hardly any water. Quite dark, quite thick. This wall needs a few verticals just to make it a little bit more convincing as blocks of stone rather than just horizontal slabs, just a few verticals. Although when I look at the source photo, when I squint my eye, I can see mostly horizontal lines, but you do detect just a few little verticals there, and then the intersection of these stones where they join up to this doorway. Swab over to my shorter synthetic brush, which is a bit stronger when I want to make these bigger marks. Then the doorway I'm going to make a bit darker at the top, so I've just taken that same colour and got a bit of a softer shadow on the top part of the doorway, and then maybe the bottom a little bit darker as well. And some verticals to give the impression of the timber doorway. I just need to lift off a little bit of paint from the front edge of this circular stone. So I put down some clear water, just softly layer that on that front edge there. Now lifting it off with the same brush, lift off a bit of paint, squeeze out the brush, then lift off a little bit of paint, squeeze off the brush, and could use a tissue as well, that just after dampening the paper, just ease it off just with a dry tissue or dry paper towel. Make the hair a little bit darker on this figure, on the shady side of that figure. Dog lead to the dog. Just make this dog a little bit taller because it's a bit too, looks like it's further up the street. So I need to bring it further, make the dog a little bit bigger and bring it closer to us. That's a little bit better. Few more marks in the foreground, bits of gravel and chippings and lines in there. Be careful not to overdo it. Lighter, lower story windows. Just a light value, nothing too dark. Some more windows on the left hand side, just dry brush marks, a little bit of cerulean blue to add in some faint verticals on the left. Neutral tint, burnt umber, bit more rooftop there on that gable end, up to a vertical edge. Burnt umber, strengthen up the front of that car, a few lights, bumpers on the parked cars. Finish off those chimneys. And we're done. As I normally do, a quick debrief of my painting, just to do a self-critique, if you like, see what worked well, see what didn't work so well. But I think I got the composition all right. I mean, following my thumbnail sketch with the figures on the left side, maybe the figures could have been a little bit more to the left and we could have less of that wall on the left, possibly. So imagine those figures just being slightly sort of in that sort of area there. That might have been a tiny bit better. I'm glad I made the end of the street a little bit bigger so I could make more of a feature of those timbers on the end there. And the right hand side I removed because of the orientation, because of the dimension of the paper. I had less of those buildings on the right hand side, so I sneaked in those couple of cars on the right there. I think that sort of worked okay, balancing that on the right, and using a number of different watercolor techniques with wash for the sky, and then a little bit of wet in wet on the brickwork, different edges as well, hard edges, soft edge there, softer edges in the shadows, and dry brush marks also, quite a few dry brush marks with that small synthetic brush and the Lebanson rigger brush. So that's the first Laycock picture. Laycock number 2 will be coming up soon or shortly in a few days' time. Going to the other end of the village, lovely village, going up towards the Abbey. Catch up with you on the next video.